I'm in the water office. Sometimes we're not in the water office because of COVID, but I'm in the water office with Diane New, who's the other co-director, and with Lisa Johnson, who is our new Lutheran Volunteer Service Corps person, and she will be with us for the year. So I want to start by introducing her and thanking you, Lisa, for being with us for 2021. Lisa is a recent graduate of Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. She's interested in going on to graduate study in religion. So what better place than water to do what she's doing? And I know, Lisa, you'll get to know a lot of people whose names and faces you'll see today. So please feel welcome and know how delighted we are to have you with us. Joe Cinto, our volunteer extraordinaire, is in the office too. He's busy with other things at the moment, so he's not able to join us. But I would like to just begin by saying that Water's efforts, including this Water Talk, are not simply academic seminars or academic exercises, but they're ways to learn in order to bring what we learn to the creation of a more just world, a more equitable world. And never has this been so acute as during the COVID pandemic, when a global pandemic has been visited upon us, as it were, and we're dealing with the effects of it. And so when Sharon Groves of Auburn Seminary recommended Emma Goldberg's book, and Emma herself to share some thoughts with us, I was delighted at the opportunity and jumped at the chance. Water is located, as many of you know, in Silver Spring, Maryland, and we've been here since 1983. But we know there's a rich history of this place long before we got here. So with a commitment to working for justice, we make this land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we're all on Indigenous land. Silver Spring, Maryland, where Water is located, is one of the traditional and contemporary lands of the Piscataway and the Nachatank, sometimes known as Anacostan peoples, the original stewards of this category. We're committed to making clear the names of these lands and of the community members from these nations who have been here and who now reside among us, whether living or dead. We acknowledge the trauma that is deeply embedded in the foundation of this country, and we recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has had an impact on Indigenous communities of color, as well as on immigrants and other peoples. We affirm the rights of all people to bring their whole selves and their stories into this space. And we confirm our intention to promote healing, respect, and love for all people, and our commitment to caring for creation. With that introduction, let me simply say something about the format of our program today, and then I will introduce our speaker. So what we do is we spend about 20 or 25 minutes hearing from someone who has produced something that we think is useful for general knowledge and information, but also we try to focus it in terms of feminist theology, ethics, and ritual. So we'll do that with Emma today, and I think it will be a very rich session, having read the book. And then we'll open the conversation to your questions and comments, to dialogue, and we will finish our time together at the top of the hour, which on the East Coast will be 2 o'clock. So again, a warm welcome to you, and we will look forward to hearing your comments as soon as Emma finishes making hers. So let me introduce Emma Goldberg, and Emma, let me extend to you a very warm Water introduction. We're not acquainted personally, but I hope that you feel at home in this circle. Emma Goldberg is a reporter at the New York Times, writing for sections such as Health and Science, Styles, Gender, National and Cultural, among others. Her cover stories have featured campus techlash, surgeon moms, young women running for office, and low-income medical students. Since the start of this coronavirus outbreak, she tells me she has turned her focus to the lives of physicians, and nurses battling the pandemic. She won the Newswomen's Club of New York Best New Journalist Award and the Sidney Hillman Foundation's Sidney Award. She was educated at Yale University and did an MPhil at the Cambridge University in England. A few weeks ago, I was channel surfing and came upon Emma talking about this book on C-SPAN. And it was fascinating, as I'm sure you will discover this afternoon. I think this is one of the early volumes in what I predict will be known as pandemic literature. Maybe it already has been named that, but I think it's what we can call pandemic literature. Emma asks, and I quote, What did the doctors who graduated medical school early at the height of the first Corona-19 wave in New York City learn about themselves and their profession, unquote. And I would add a question to that, Emma. What can we learn about ourselves through them? So I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. And I turn the mic over now to you, and we look forward to hearing your presentation of this wonderful book, which I will be hawking shamelessly during the hour. It's called Life on the Line. Life on the Line. And the subtitle is Young Doctors Come of Age in a Pandemic. And some of you, I'm sure, will remember reading about young doctors in New York who left medical school early, a few months before they would have begun their internships, in order to be on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. What a, as it were, baptism by fire into one's profession. This is a book that has been published by HarperCollins in 2020, and I really do recommend this to you as a very interesting read and something that you could share, especially those of you in chaplaincy, by the way, with your colleagues. You will find yourselves in this book, even if you're doing chaplaincy rather than the medical work. It's all of a piece. So with that, I welcome you, Emma, and thank you very much for taking time to join us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for welcoming me into this space. It's these are all the issues that you work on are all very near and dear to my heart. Particularly, I've been connected to Auburn Seminary for a long time and have drawn so much inspiration and wisdom from their teaching. So I'm grateful to be in this group of people and to hopefully get to, really have a lively conversation today, especially having heard in the opening that some of you are actually in the hospital right now and doing chaplaincy work connected to the medical space. So it would also be very curious to hear about your experiences over the.
They may be your next book, Emma. So
yeah,
they may be your next book.
And I actually have done a little bit of reporting about chaplains in hospitals in around the country, really. And in April of 2020, I did a story speaking with chaplains who had been administering last rites to COVID patients around the country. Some of them who had actually themselves fallen sick. So this is a type of work that has really inspired me for a long time, particularly since the start of the pandemic. So I'd love for that to be part of the conversation as well. And just to really open it up, I actually wrote a story as well about a week and a half ago about an atheist chaplain who just became president of the chaplains at Harvard. And I know that's something that might touch on some of your work as well. So if you want to bring that into the conversation, definitely would love to hear thoughts and questions about that as well. But I'll start talking a little bit about Life on the Line. So last spring in New York was a really terrifying time. And I was really watching a city that I know and love be transformed by crisis. But instead of being able to rush out and help, and particularly do what journalists are used to doing, which is jumping right into the thick of things, we were really locked down in our homes. And we were watching the news descend into this feeling of gloom and doom, watching the headlines just start proclaiming that the city was looking like a battlefield and that the hospitals were feeling like war zones. And I felt a little bit of a sense of paralysis as a reporter stuck at home and wondering what were the stories that were going to emerge and how could I best put a spotlight on the people who were battling the pandemic and on the survivors and the victims who were already seeing their lives upended by it. And so I was very inspired to get to the chance to report on a remarkable group of young people who were choosing to graduate from their medical schools early to help in the hospitals that were overwhelmed by a crush of COVID patients. And I want to stop and think about that particular moment for those young people. Because when I first reported this story for the New York Times, what struck me was that these were people who were in their really mostly mid-20s, some of them late 20s, and they were at a moment of transition in which they were beginning to wrestle with what it meant to take on the identity of doctors and to move from being students to taking care of their own patients and to assuming all the responsibility that comes with. And because they were in that moment of transition, not all of them felt 100% comfortable already really taking on that full identity of saying, yes, I am a doctor, I'm an MD, you can entrust your lives or your family's lives with me. That's not something that they were fully accustomed to doing yet because they were still in their fourth year of medical school. And in fact, for those of you who are familiar with the medical field, you might know the fourth year of medical school is actually traditionally pretty laid back. It's the time when people get a little bit of breathing room before they transition into being full doctors. So it was March of their fourth year, and they were going through what's called match day, where they were being placed into the institutions where they would do the next phase of their training called residency. And then suddenly they found out from their schools in emails overnight that they would get the opportunity to graduate early and move to the front lines and start treating COVID patients. For some of them, that happened as quickly as days. So they graduated on a Friday, and by Monday, they were starting to see their first COVID patients. So that's a remarkably fast transformation. And the first question that really called up for me, which touches on what you, Mary, brought up in the introduction, is what does courage look like? And what does it mean to feel a calling to jump into a particular situation of crisis? And I think the first lesson I learned from them is that courage doesn't always look exactly like what we think it's going to look like. Because I think we have this idea sometimes that courage looks like fearlessness. And what I really heard from these young people, these doctors, is that courage isn't always fearlessness. In fact, it's often sometimes carrying your own fear and compartmentalizing it or carrying it alongside your commitment to doing the really tough work. And in fact, it means sometimes doing work that you're not necessarily prepared for because no one could possibly be prepared for it. And what really showed that to me was one of the doctors who I was speaking with. The very first time that he signed his name as an MD was on a death certificate. So the very first time that he had to sign his name, doctor, was checking in his very first patient who died about 45 minutes later, and he had to certify the death. And that's something I think that no one can be prepared for. It's simply not the type of thing that you can be trained to know how to handle. It's just the type of thing that when you're faced with it, you learn new layers of your own kind of courage and resilience and identity. And that's something that he really shared with me. And another aspect of it, of courage, I think that came through was learning that sometimes your training can't fully prepare you, but you can tap below your training for the kind of layers of commitment to the work that kind of drew you to a field in the first place, but that you didn't necessarily know you would be called on to bring forth so early. So a lot of the doctors I followed were trained in this generation of young doctors who really put relationships at the center of their medical care. They were trained, they came after a generation that was often, I think, seen by a lot of people as maybe more removed, more authoritative. Doctors were seen as these kind of, high up figures in white coats who sort of gave orders and suggestions and recommendations from on high. And there wasn't necessarily a lot of warmth in the interactions with patients. And these doctors kind of pushed back on that. They brought to their work a very different sensibility. A lot of them were drawn to being doctors because they really want to care for patients who are vulnerable, who come from communities that have been traditionally sort of left out of the medical system, communities of color, low-income communities, immigrant communities, and they want to cultivate a real sense of trust. So that's the instinct that drew them to the work. And yet on their first days in the COVID ward, they learned that the work was going to look very different because, first of all, they had to reduce the amount of time that they were spending at patients' bedsides. So that right away, changes the interactions that they were having with patients. Second of all, they had to wear masks and their patients had to wear masks, as we all know well. So they couldn't necessarily see facial expressions as much. And that really changed the nature of the interactions. And they had to learn to use their body language a lot more. Third, the families couldn't be in the room at first. So a lot of times the context that you get for a patient is in interacting with their children and with their parents and with their spouses. So you're getting to know your patient through all of their loved ones, but the loved ones weren't in the room. They were all on the phone. And so that really changed the kind of context and relationship that these doctors could build with their patients. And so that was another kind of shift for them. Fourth, they were in a lot of cases, because of that, the only emotional support system that the patients had. So there was a whole new level of reliance and emotional, kind of bonding that was happening. And lastly, a lot of times they were losing patients much more rapidly than any doctors normally would, at least any, normal internal medicine or emergency physicians, because some of them lost their patients within 45 minutes or 24 hours or 48 hours of admitting them. And that really changes the nature of the relationship and the nature of what they realize they can bring to it, because they realize that maybe they couldn't, they were taught to heal, they were taught to save lives, but in the moment, sometimes all they could bring was their humanity and their presence and all of that kind of attendant comfort. So there were all these layers of what they were learning being a doctor means that doctors normally don't learn, within their first days or weeks or months on the wards. So I was learning a lot about kind of what it means to be prepared for something and what it means to realize no one could be prepared for something, but that you will find the reserves of courage and resilience and humanity that's needed for the situation. I also want to talk about why I chose the particular group of doctors who are in this book. And it was very important to me to choose doctors who represented a kind of new face of medicine. So in the US, the medical field is still predominantly white. It's still predominantly male. It's under 6% are Hispanic, under 5% are African American. And I wanted to follow a group of doctors who were in some ways challenging that kind of homogenous face of the field. One of the young women I followed was Hispanic. One is first generation American. One is queer. And he really brought to the work all the kind of memories of studying the AIDS epidemic. And the kind of some of the doctors who fled from giving care during that crisis. So it was all the more important to him to show up in the face of this new virus that was hitting marginalized communities first and hardest. And one of the things I discovered in the course of doing the research for this book, is that actually diversity in the medical field is not at all like a nice to have. It's not like a soft layer of culture in the medical field. It actually changes the clinical outcomes. So I was really gratified to learn that research is being done on something called concordance, which is that when the doctor and the patient match up in race or other factors of identity, sometimes the health outcomes are actually better. And there was a really fascinating study done called the Oakland Men's Health Disparity Project. It was done by some doctors, Dr. Owen Garrick and Dr. Marcella Alston at Harvard. And they did a fascinating study where they stood up a freestanding clinic in Oakland and staffed it with Black doctors. And then they brought in Black patients, and they had some of them seeing Black doctors, some of them seeing white doctors. And they actually found that when the Black patients were seen by Black doctors, they were more likely to consent to all sorts of elective procedures, including diabetes screenings and cholesterol tests. So what they found is actually it changes the health outcomes when patients are seen by doctors who look like them. So in other words, one of the undercurrents that I wanted to look at in this book is what are the arguments for diversity in the medical field from a health perspective? And do patients actually have better outcomes when they're able to see doctors who come from the communities from which they come? And the answer, research has shown, is often yes. And I think that's all the more urgent in the context of a pandemic that has disproportionately hospitalized and affected communities of color in the US. And that was very true in the early weeks of the pandemic in New York, that Black and Hispanic New Yorkers were falling sick, being hospitalized, and dying at far higher rates than white patients, than white New Yorkers. And that really, also added an emotional layer for the doctors of color, because they were seeing this virus hitting the communities from which they came. And that just added a whole new layer of exhaustion and burnout and grief on top of just their day-to-day work. And so if it's okay now, I want to read a little bit of a section from the book that I hope will, also provide fodder for discussion. Okay, so this is, right around the middle of the book. Around the time the doctors first reported for hospital duty, the city, being New York, was at 4 times its normal death rate. There was a New Yorker dying almost every 2 minutes. Their first day came just past the peak of city COVID deaths, but that was only clear in hindsight. At the time, their teams wondered if the count might continue to mount. That uncertainty bred its own kind of nebulous angst. It wasn't just the rookies feeling the weight of the frontline care. Even the country's veteran doctors found themselves tested by the weeks of COVID crisis. There were doctors who served on the front lines of September 11th, Hurricane Katrina, the AIDS crisis, the West Nile virus scare, the anthrax scare, Ebola, some combination of the above. But COVID felt worse, the fear heavier, the death toll higher. The difficulty for frontline providers was partly in the lessons that had to be unlearned. Many of the mores of medicine were challenged, some cast off entirely. Dr. Fred Valentine, who helped treat Bellevue Hospital's first HIV patients, developed a lecture for his trainees on treating novel infectious diseases entitled, "We've Never Seen This Before." He quickly realized that some of the lessons from the AIDS crisis held true during the COVID era. Namely, when treating new diseases, sometimes old rules and traditions no longer applied. "Figure things out, you guys are smart," he told his trainees. "Particularly in the area of infectious disease, you're frequently seeing things no one has seen before. That means you gotta think, put things together." During the early weeks of COVID, one of the new challenges for providers was widespread concern about ventilator allocation. The country's hospitals were estimated to have about 62,000 ventilators at the start of the pandemic, and the Strategic National Stockpile didn't have sufficient backups because of a contract with a private firm that fell apart in the years preceding the COVID outbreak. As the surge of COVID patients mounted, many doctors worried that ICUs would become overwhelmed and there wouldn't be enough ventilators for everyone in need. That led to difficult questions. In a choice between two sick patients, who would get priority access to a ventilator? And how could this decision be made fairly? Some patients and doctors worried that racial bias could affect those choices, just as Black and Hispanic patients were getting harder hit by the disease. In 2015, the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law, created during the AIDS crisis, worked with the New York State Department of Health to revise earlier guidelines on how to allocate ventilators during a pandemic. The task force decided that rather than giving out ventilators on a first come, first served basis, the decision had to be made by taking people's health conditions and likelihood of survival into account. The crux of the decision should be a person's sequential organ failure assessment score, which measures any dysfunction in 6 organs and systems. The task force stipulated that ventilator access should never be determined by non-medical factors, such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, or ability to pay. It was important to be as objective as possible. Still, these were guidelines, not hard and fast rules. Doctors, patients, and their families worried about what extraneous factors might mold these life or death decisions. If the surge kept mounting, if ICU beds got more overwhelmed, would someone uninsured, Black or Hispanic, be shunned to the side? As early as March and April, there had been cautionary tales of Black people in New York denied care, like beloved Brooklyn middle school teacher Rana Zoe Mungan, who died of COVID-19 after being twice denied a coronavirus test. The disparities were becoming rapidly apparent. Another challenge for new doctors was the pervasive fear of infection. For the most part, neither senior physicians nor new patients had been trained to worry for their lives while caring for patients. Tuberculosis patients carried the risk of infecting their doctors, and providers treating people with AIDS learned to draw blood carefully so as not to be infected by a needle stick. But for the most part, their concern was for the patients and not themselves. Until the COVID weeks. Suddenly, every hospital worker, regardless of seniority, carried the same worries. Did I don and doff my PPE correctly? Is my mask snug enough to protect my airways? These questions had to come before patient care. In the first few days, there were moments when a cardiac patient coded, and overzealous doctors started to rush into the room without their gowns and shields. The more cautious physicians had to remind everyone to protect themselves first. Affixing your own mask first flies in the face of what doctors are trained to do: leap into action for their patients. They are intimately familiar with the importance of speed. They can quantify all that's lost in oxygen and brain activity in taking even 3 extra minutes to properly secure PPE before responding to a code. So those steps for self-protection can feel like a selfish part of the medical equation, a subtraction from patient care. For many of the early graduates, the hardest part of this was the wedge it drove between doctor and patient. After all their studies of patient-centered care, they were told they could barely spend time with patients. They had to minimize their minutes at the bedside. They struggled to see their faces through the layers of PPE. Studies indicate that a medical worker's physical touch can promote better health outcomes, yet doctors had to be cautious about leaving themselves exposed. The fear of infection made for a difficult training environment, but it also prompted doctors to think more creatively and intentionally about their communication with patients. The challenges of treating COVID-19 patients didn't erase the need to build trust. It just made this work more complicated. The unconventional thinking that novel diseases require can help trainees to become better doctors. The new disease may not fit into the body of knowledge you already have, said AIDS expert Dr. Valentine. You have to prepare to be surprised. So with that, I want to open to questions from the group, and it can be anything about the process of the book or what the new doctors saw or the reporting on chaplains in the hospitals as well. I'm open to really anything and want to hear about your experiences this last year as well.
Please unmute yourself and say your name. And if you want to say just a word of identification, that's fine. If you don't, just ask your question or make your comment. And the floor is now open, and I will moderate the questions again with thanks to Emma Goldberg, and how delighted we are to have you with us. Mary Ann Olenek.
Thank you, Ms. Goldberg. That was a very powerful presentation. And the paradigms that you discussed and the new way of looking at things will be haunting. I've read a lot of your pieces in the Times, and I'm so happy to thank you in person now, as it is for writing what you do. My question is, how did you manage to maintain your own stability through all this? Were you drawn into the pain to an extent that you thought it impaired your ability to be dispassionate in any sense?
That's a really good question. And I think it's been a question coming out of the pandemic for so many people is, how to both respond to all of the grief and all of the loss and also preserve ourselves and preserve our ability to keep doing the work that feels most meaningful and needed in this moment. And I heard that from the doctors as well, certainly. And I think, first of all, I was really invigorated getting to know these young people, because the doctors in this book were not only doing extremely difficult work and doing it well, but they were really maintaining a sense of joy, really, and humor and just humanity all through even the darkest days of the crisis in New York. And on my daily or weekly calls with them, just hearing the kind of the jubilance and energy in their voice, it really was sort of infectious for me, because I was feeding off of their energy as they were doing this extremely challenging work. And I think they were feeding off the energy of the city as it really came together, and people were more supportive of one another, I think, than they had been in a long time. There was the beautiful tradition of clapping at 7 p.m. that I know the healthcare workers loved. And whenever I participated in that, I sort of felt like it was communing with the doctors a little bit too, because I would go out onto the street and clap and hear my neighbors clapping and hear people ringing cowbells and banging pots and pans, and thinking that was a tribute that we were all making to the healthcare workers. And then I was hearing firsthand from the healthcare workers how much that meant to them. So I think there were these feedback loops of support and energy where people were really, had one another's backs. And that was one source of real energy for me throughout. And then I would just say also that continuing to, I always find, other kind of artwork and music and books, and just continuing to kind of keep a connection to types of art that are totally outside the current moment. I always find that to be like a real kind of life preservation thing, because whenever things are especially hard to watch a movie or listen to music or have listen to something that feels a little bit outside the current moment, it's just a reminder of how much we've been through in the hardest of times, and how much we'll keep getting through. So definitely continuing to find other sources of art and inspiration throughout really helped as well.
Thanks, Mary, for the question, and Emma for the thorough answer. Who'd like to be next? Mallory, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Mallory Naake. I think Mary said at the beginning, I did an internship at Water for 2 years while I was in seminary in DC.
And we still miss you, Mallory.
Yeah, but I, like Mary said at the beginning too, I've been working as a hospital chaplain. So and I've been in this hospital for 3 years. I've been a chaplain for 4. So much of what you said, Emma, was resonating with me. So I'm trying to figure out how to pull out some of my reflections. I guess speaking as a chaplain, so at the beginning of the pandemic, none of the non-medical staff were even going at our hospital, were even going into the COVID units because we weren't sure what was going on. There wasn't enough PPE. So we didn't want to take that away from the medical team. But kind of as the months went forward, on a voluntary basis, the ICU in one of the units that I had been assigned to turned into the COVID unit. So I kind of said, I'm going to step back into this. And what it really looked like for me, I had to kind of wrestle with what is my role here, because I couldn't go to the bedside at that point. Families weren't coming in, and support over the phone is just so difficult. There's no eye contact. There's no, families are so worried about what is even happening with their loved one that it's hard to establish relationships over the phone. And so I really saw my role as support to the staff who were going into the room. So how am I supporting them so that they then can be the emotional and spiritual support, which is who I am for the patients. And so that's what that kind of looked like at the beginning. And then eventually I started going into the rooms kind of on when we would determine it was a needed basis. Of course, with COVID patients, they can't, a lot of times you're having shortness of breath. And so having a conversation about fears and support or relaxation, that's hard, when people are on machines that are pushing air into their lungs, or when they desat every time they try to talk. But I would go in for kind of decision-making discussions, and then also like end of life when there was a religious need. And so that's kind of what my role looked like. Now I'm going into rooms even more, especially since I was vaccinated in January. But I think really my role shifted to I think as a chaplain, we're always there for the staff, they're here all the time. But that's really how my role looked. And it was a time of helplessness almost as well, like feeling like, what can I do in this situation? I'm not physically saving lives, but how can I emotionally support folks through this really, really difficult time? And there were I had a lot of remembrances coming up as you were sharing.
Well, first of all, I want to say, Mallory, thank you so much for doing that work, because I heard firsthand, from so many patients and from staff, how much it helped to have kind of spiritual support, even when it had to be remote. I think it was never more needed than over the last year and a half. And I want to say what you're sharing too really resonates with the reporting I did. I wrote an article, as I mentioned at the beginning, about chaplains in hospitals during COVID. And I think not everyone thought of chaplains as part of the first line kind of responders, but it was such a critical part of the hospital ecosystem, and remains so right now more than ever. And I think that when people are, I think one thing I want to share is that the doctors who I interviewed, both for the book and for all the reporting over the last year, saw some circumstances that I think would just really test anyone's faith and just spiritual kind of sustenance. And I remember one doctor I interviewed telling me about how he was caring for a mother and the mother's daughter. They both had COVID and they were both in the same hospital room. And one night the mother coded, like she, started, her lungs started failing, and she died with the daughter in the bed next to her. And the daughter heard her mother dying, and there was nothing they could do to get the daughter out of the room in time. And for the doctor, it was this moment of a kind of crisis of faith and of, just spirituality and just everything. It just really weighs on you. And so I think having people who are trained to provide spiritual support was so critically necessary. And I also want to recognize, like you said, how much more challenging that work got. Because for some chaplains, I think in some areas of the country, when some of the chaplains I interviewed, for example, in Seattle, when COVID was first starting to circulate there in February and March, they were going into the hospital in person, and we didn't know as much about transmission then, and they didn't always have completely appropriate PPE, and some of them did fall sick. And so that work was really challenging. But then for the chaplains who had to do their work remotely, that was also really challenging because, like you said, you're not in the room and you can't like squeeze someone's hand or do the normal gestures that you might to offer support. So I think no matter what circumstances you were working under, the work got more challenging. And not to divert subjects, but just to kind of expand, I think similarly, medical interpreters are, a category of staff who were in some ways overlooked during some parts of the pandemic, but their work was completely essential and way more challenging because some of them were doing the work in person, some were working remotely, but medical interpreters help with patients who don't speak English. And they, enable the communication between the medical team and the patients. And there were a lot of COVID patients who didn't speak English because this pandemic was hitting hard in immigrant communities and among communities of color, frontline responders. So all of those people, were disproportionately filling the hospitals. And I remember interviewing a doctor who said he believed fundamentally that his non-English speaking patients were getting worse care because the interpreters couldn't be there in person in a lot of instances. And it's very hard to communicate when someone can't fully breathe or they're on oxygen and they're trying to talk into a phone. And then the interpreter on the phone is trying to repeat their words to the doctor in a very noisy room where people are coding and there are alarms going off. So I think there are a lot of different classes of people who are doing completely essential work, from chaplains to interpreters, who I think aren't always recognized as fully as they could be in the context of the pandemic, frontline responders. So I think I'm really glad that you shared your experiences. I'm so grateful that you were doing the work that you were doing. Thank you.
Thank you both. That's just the reason to have this conversation. I have a two-part question, Emma, if I might. One has to do with training and the other has to do with reflection, and the kind of two bookends. The training question is, did you get any sense if your people, your 6 doctors and others that you talked to, had any sense, any training or any information even about the religious backgrounds and experiences of the people they were working with, and how those might shape their patients' choices about treatment or death? Did they know anything about traditions other than their own? I mean, in some instances, like you had, there was a Jewish doctor, and there was there were others whose religiosity was identified. But I just wonder if you had any sense, because Mallory's so raising such an important point, that it's not just the chaplains for whom that's the case, but I just wonder what they learned. And I also wondered, if their training was very specialized, did you notice any difference between people who were very specialized in their training in terms of their ability to jump right in with the COVID stuff, like somebody who's going into internal medicine? Did they do better? In other words, was the broader training, did it set them up better to be able to do this if it was out of their field? I'm just wondering about the training. And the reason I'm asking has to do with the reflection question. I wonder if you've had any input from your people in recent months, since the book came out last year, and I know, books take a while to get out and so forth, but if you've had any reflection from them, if they've had any sense in the midst of the crushing workload and the urgency, do they have any distillation of those reflections of what's gone on for them? Because I think that would be so helpful for people training in religion to figure out how we can be most useful. Because I think the training typically has been like the training in medicine, you become a specialist in this or that or the other, a specialist in Christianity or so. But now the needs are all across the board. So I'm just wondering if you see any connections there that might help us to transform some of the training, both in medicine and religion, and also helping people to have this kind of deeper reflection as they deal with these things down the pike.
Those are both great questions. Thank you so much, Mary. I'll start with, the first question about religiosity. I actually have to say it didn't really come up in conversation with the doctors, whether they talked about patients' religion at all. I'm not sure whether that really came up in the context of their care. I definitely will say that for the doctor I followed, who was Orthodox Jewish, that was certainly, a big part of her work in the hospital too, for numerous reasons. One being that she had to figure out really, first of all, what she was comfortable with in terms of working on the Sabbath, for example. And she ultimately decided that if she was called into work in the hospital on the Sabbath, she would do so because of the Jewish injunction that, saving a life comes before anything else. And that
Which
was
her
something
father
that,
gave her as good, which you reported that her father gave her as really great advice. And I thought it was beautiful.
exactly. Yeah. She consulted her father and he told her it's a phrase in Hebrew, pikuach nefesh, which is, like the healing of the soul or saving of the soul, which means really any Jewish law can be really, not violated, or, the Jewish law that comes before all else is the injunction to save a life. And so she had an evening, for example, one of her early evenings in the hospital where the sun set and the Sabbath had started and she was still working, which entailed using a computer and driving home. And she had to kind of, grapple with what that meant. So I think her religiosity was really present for her in the hospital. Something she shared with me that I thought was really powerful was her father actually fell sick while she was working in the hospital. And she was saying, which surprised me, that she didn't necessarily feel more of a calling to pray during those weeks or to put her personal experience central to the prayer. And what she said was that her father always said that he doesn't believe in a foul shot God, meaning he doesn't believe in the type of like God that you call on when everything's kind of gone, up in the, when there's crisis, because I think the relationships for them are deeper. It's about like a lifelong relationship and not just kind of calling God up when you really need God. And so I found that to be really powerful. And her father, thankfully, has recovered and is home and safe and healthy, which is great. But certainly, this is all to say that questions of faith and spirituality, I think, were center stage for a lot of them. But I don't think it, as far as at least I know, it didn't necessarily come up in conversation with patients so much. At least I think there was so much kind of crisis care going on that they weren't necessarily the people having those conversations with patients. The second question about training is also a great question. And what was interesting for me to learn was that some of the doctors I followed were not trained, or they're not going to be specializing in internal medicine. One of them is going to be a pediatrician, and another one was doing what's called med peds, which is a kind of combined pediatrics and internal medicine. One of them is going to be an emergency physician. So they're going into different specialties, but they were all kind of leaping into action to help with COVID patients. And I think, thankfully, what helped all of them is that in medical school, you really get a foundation that's broad. You have to rotate through a lot of different clinical rotations, and that includes covering a lot of the basics that will be needed for internal medicine. So I think they all did feel like they had the training, and thankfully they hadn't really started specializing yet because they hadn't actually started residency. So they graduated from medical school, went immediately into doing the COVID care, and then started residency in July following that. So I think thankfully they felt like they had the training that was needed. But I will say that one of them shared with me, for example, that she had decided she very much wanted to go into pediatrics because caring for older patients was hard for her, because it really reminded her of her grandmother who passed away, who she was very close with. And it reminded her of her grandmother's final days, and that was painful for her. So I think it was really hard for her to go back to caring for the most part, much older patients, because that was something that she had consciously shifted away from and wanting to work with younger children. So I think it brought up different emotional challenges that they weren't necessarily prepared for. But clinically, I think they felt like they had the skills necessary. And the other thing I'll say is that COVID was novel for everyone. It wasn't just them. It was every doctor was learning in real time what it meant to care for patients who had this disease. And really the whole country was learning. We were learning, that hydroxychloroquine didn't really work, or, there were all of these new things that were coming up day by day. And so they were actually learning with their senior doctors in real time, and they were sharing learnings. They were all kind of picking up lessons and exchanging information. And in some cases, the junior doctors might have pretty much the same level of expertise about COVID as the senior doctors, because they all jumped into action at the same time. So I think clinically, they felt prepared. They felt like their training had gotten them to where they needed to be. And that being said, I think they were ready and excited to transition into their residencies when the time came in July, because that was what they trained to do. And those were the specialties they'd chosen.
Yeah, I was particularly taken by the story you told of the psychiatric resident who was a couple of years older than the doctor she was working with, and how he noticed, which was interesting, that she had, although her clinical skills were not as good as his, or certainly not as fresh as his at that point, but as you reported it, he recognized that she was really good at the conversations with people whose family members were dying, or with the patients themselves. And so I thought that was a very interesting kind of juxtaposition of what you would expect, that he had the wisdom already to see what she was good at, and that he could learn from her, even though she was asking him to come and do certain procedures that he was quite adept at. So I found that really a new thing. Who else? Thank you, Emma. Who else would like to ask a question? Please go ahead. Our time is running short, so this would be your moment. Yes, please, Honor.
Emma, are you still in touch with these doctors through their residency, and how has it affected them, or impacted anybody change their choices after this impact with COVID?
Yeah, very much still in touch with them. I actually went to Six Flags with a couple of them over Labor Day weekend because they had a day off. So that was really fun. It's very surreal to think that like a year ago, we were communicating in the depths of the crisis, and now we can go to an amusement park together because we know we could be masked and outdoors and all of that. We're vaccinated. So that was a joy. And I've caught up with a lot of them this summer. I think actually I was struck by the fact that I don't think it really, none of them expressed any degree to which it like made them question their choices. I think they were all 100% satisfied with their choices to go graduate early and to work in the COVID wards. I think it actually helped them to start residency off feeling even a little bit ahead of the curve. Like they'd already been in the hospital for weeks and been in the hospital under extremely challenging circumstances. So unlike some of their co-interns who were starting completely fresh, they were actually starting really knowing their way around the hospitals and knowing the team. So I think, and one of them mentioned to me, she started residency in Massachusetts. And when she started, all the other interns were kind of whispering about her, saying like, oh, were you the one who was in New York in the COVID wards? And there was this degree of like real respect for what they'd done. So all of them were really satisfied with the choice. I think intern year is really, really challenging for everyone, regardless of where they're or what year it is. Whether there's a pandemic, no pandemic, it's just a really hard year because the hours are incredibly intense. It's, 6 days a week, just you're constantly working. You get your 2 weeks of vacation and that's it. So it's really, really hard. And I think they were all kind of feeling that at the end of the year, but it didn't seem to me to be any more than what people would normally feel coming out of intern year. I think they felt really gratified to have been able to do work that felt meaningful to them and at a time of such need. Thank you so much for the question. Great question.
Thank you. Anybody else? I have just a totally a lit crit question, and that has to do with language, the language of the new pandemic language. And I just so appreciated your quoting Susan Sontag on cancer and referring to the literature around AIDS that has helped us to think anew about some of these things. I remember a doctor who gave a lecture at Harvard Divinity School, the Ingersoll lecture on immortality, and he was a physician, Jonathan Mann, who was very much engaged in the early AIDS work. And he talked about long after the cure for AIDS came along, we'd still be dealing with the social inequalities that predate it. And I think there's a lot of that here too, that even though COVID will go away, the social inequalities that you've laid out, I think are very helpful. But I'm wondering, do you see, as a writer, do you see any new language emerging? And my concern is this: so much of the language, and you quoted it very well, is bellicose language. It's like we've got to fight the war and conquer the enemy and vanquish the disease, and that's very sort of reflexive language that we use as Americans a lot for something that's challenging. I just wonder what it would be like if nonviolence and peace work became sort of the frame for the language that we used to talk about this kind of experience. Does that resonate at all with you, or is it something?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that, because that's really, like, as a language nerd, that was one of my favorite kind of things to tangle with in
Yeah.
the book. And one of the reasons I wanted to include this kind of chapter looking at the wartime languages, I wanted to accurately reflect the fact that so much of the language was around, like, the battle, the hospital as a battlefield and the doctors as warriors. And I wanted to reflect that accurately, but also complicate it, because the doctors who I was speaking with at Montefiore, they were called like the coalition forces, is what they called the early graduates.
Yeah.
And at NYU, they were referred to them in their graduation as the COVID army. So that was very much part of their reality. And at the same time, I wanted to complicate it because I don't think it rang true for all of them 100%. It certainly feels, to some degree in tension with the whole framework of do no harm. Because when you're told to do no harm, it then feels funny to kind of be told, like, go out and fight this, bring your aggression and your, war battle spirit. That feels complicated. And there's actually been there's a linguist, Elena Semino, who did a fascinating study showing that battle-like language around cancer is actually damaging for cancer patients' mental health, because it makes them feel like there's this battle to be won. And if their health turns, then they're, like, losing, and it's the blame is on them. So it actually can be very toxic to use that kind of language for the patients. And I think for the doctors too, it can be hard because it makes them feel like there's this kind of inevitability to the casualties. And that there is, like, it's par for the course, like the wartime loss. And I think in a hospital where the framework is do no harm, and you're drawn to the work by a desire to heal, I think that can feel misplaced. So I found Susan Sontag to be also a really helpful framework for both accurately reflecting the fact that the battle language was everywhere in the air, and also complicating it and reflecting the degree to which it didn't resonate for all the patients and the doctors, even while it felt powerful and invigorating for others.
Yeah, that's great. You also, you also referred to moral injury, which has been a topic we've taken up here more than once, especially with Rita Nakashima-Brock and people working on that. And so I thought that's another way in, but that might be some stuff for later. I'm hoping for later writing, as I will be watching for your byline with great interest. So Emma, there's much here to continue talking about, but we're at the end of our time. So I'm going to wrap this up, invite people to stay longer if you wish, but to bring our time to a formal close. And then those who wish to stay on to chat a little bit more are welcome to do so. I want to thank you, Emma Goldberg, for this wonderful book. And again, I will mention it one last time. It is Life on the Line, and it is the story of young doctors coming of age in the pandemic. I highly recommend it. It's a HarperCollins book, and get it, read it, share it. It's well worth it. I want to thank Emma Goldberg one more time, and just to say, Emma Goldberg, you are a real treasure, and you are doing marvelous work. And I thank Sharon Groves for letting us. She's a friend of your mother, by the way. And she really recommended this, and I think it was a great recommendation. So again, thank you all for being with us, and please feel free to stay on for a conversation, those who wish, and those who would like to be gracefully excused, this is your moment. So again, thanks,
so great
Emma.
To meet all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope
so
we'll have
much.
you again. Keep in touch with us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all for making the time.